Hi, Marko. It's nice to meet you again.
Hi, Andres. Nice to meet you too.
And this time we will speak about your piece, 11 Rooms. Maybe you can shortly give some background on of the piece, who commissioned, and
Yes. This was commissioned by Klexos. Klexos is a group from Spain. The setting of the group is for saxophone players. So originally it was actually a saxophone quartet. And then they were joined by a multimedia performer who does often electronics, but often also visual things. And so when he joined them, it was also a little bit a kind of change of direction, that they went more for the combination of using saxophone with technology. And as I said, often also in audiovisual contexts. And they invited me to, they're also organizing a summer workshop in Plasencia and in Spain, and they invited me as a coach for this summer course as composition teacher, because they always organize this course with on one hand lessons in saxophone playing, but then also lessons in composition, and they invite other teachers every year. And so that year I was invited, and for this occasion they also commissioned me to write a new piece for them, which they premiered at this occasion.
And how long is the piece, and how many instruments? And
I'm using 4 instruments, and then the multimedia performer, he's taking care of interactive visuals. More specifically, this is something I realized in Unity. So it's actually a 3D environment that the performer has to navigate in, similar like when you're navigating through a game. You're actually in a virtual house, and you have to just walk around in the house through different spaces. And then this is interacting with the 4 performers who are distributed in the performance space. And so the performers in a way have an influence on how the multimedia performer has to move through the space, but also the other way around. Then the things that happen in the space also give cues to the performers to play specific material. And that's how the piece progresses through a number of sections. That's in a way the main part of the piece, but then you could say roughly the piece consists of 3 main sections. What I just described is you could say concert part of the piece. But then there is a section in the beginning where the performers are not yet in their playing positions. In fact, they are not even in the same space where they will perform the piece, but they are sort of mingling with the audience and then starting the performance there by playing sounds from tablets where also videos are running. And then they're also playing, but not with the saxophones, only the mouthpieces. This is in a way the first section. Then they lead the audience into the performance space where like the concert part takes place. And then in the end, the whole performance dissolves in a way, because the audience is invited to use their phones to read a QR code, which is displayed on a screen. And with this QR code, they can load different little films, which also contain sound. And these little films, I will say something more about those films a bit later. But here the idea was actually that the performance moves from sort of the space, the concert space, to the devices of the audience. So in a way, the musicians then fade to the background, stop playing, and the sound is only emitted through the phones of the audience.
And what is the main message of the piece?
Well, I mean, I always find it difficult to say what is the main message, and I also wouldn't like to narrow it down to one message. But what the piece deals with is, in a way, this relationship between the private space and the public space. And my point of departure was that when you're playing a classical instrument, of course, you're trying to perfect your playing skills in order to eventually stand in front of an audience in a public space and present your work. And what happens before that are many, many, many hours that you spend alone at home, practicing, and practicing. And so this was in a way what triggered this. But then we were in the middle of the Corona time when I composed this piece. So that was already an interesting period regarding this dichotomy between the private and the public, because in a way we were, through the lockdowns, we were forced to stay in the private space, but then the private space was more and more becoming a public space because we were constantly on Zoom, big parts of our lives were taking place on Zoom, so the private space was not what is usually understood as a private space anymore. And so what I did in this piece is the sort of modeling which is taking place in the 3D environment is a house, as I already mentioned, but the individual rooms are actually the rooms of the individual saxophone players. And then throughout this building, there are a large number of surveillance cameras. So you're actually looking at those private spaces of the individual members of the ensemble through surveillance cameras, which are throughout this building. All of that, as I said, is just modeled in Unity. But then the multimedia player, he's in a way navigating through these different rooms. And so actually what's happening and what is in a way creating a certain musical dynamic in the piece is that he has to move through this building trying not to be seen on the surveillance cameras. And you can see how the surveillance cameras, there are always 4 active at the same time. I think there is a total of 8 virtual surveillance cameras in the house. And so it keeps switching between those 8. And then you kind of have to sneak by that and try not to be seen by the cameras, which of course doesn't work out. And then once you're seen, then the other musicians can act in certain ways. And so this keeps a kind of interactive relationship going, and also creates a very immediate connection between the virtual space that you see on a large screen as a projection, as an audience member, and the actual musicians acting in the space. In addition, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just interrupted you, right? So maybe I have a question.
But I just wanted to say maybe just one more thing is that in addition to this virtual space, I asked the musicians of the ensemble to record themselves doing everyday stuff. So I asked them, just take your phone and record yourself how you're vacuuming your apartment, preparing coffee or food, or making your bed, just banal everyday things. So I really wanted to have those snapshots from their private lives, and they were really great. They were very inventive in what they captured, and so they sent me a lot of material. And on one hand, the visual material consists of this virtual space, but then I'm also using a lot of this sort of original footage from the private lives of these musicians. And this is also the material that they're playing in the very beginning on the tablets when they're starting the piece, not yet in the concert space, but in the space where the audience is waiting to enter the concert hall. And that's where the performance starts. Sorry, what did you want to ask?
Why 11 rooms, right? Why is this title?
Because there are a total of 9 rooms in the virtual house. And then there is the 10th room, which is the concert hall, plus the 11th room, which is the room outside of the concert hall where the performance starts.
Okay,
Simple answer.
Got it. And what was maybe main sensorial principles, right, which you would like to somehow, what kind of experience, watching, right, or listening experience you would like to create during the piece?
I was really very concerned about this idea of the private and the public. And what I wanted to create also with this scene in the very beginning, where the audience is just waiting outside to enter the concert hall, and then suddenly the musicians start to perform with those tablets and create sounds in addition to it. I wanted to bring all of them together. And so I wanted to create this kind of mixing of the performers and the audience, that there is not this sort of threshold between the stage area and the auditorium. So the musicians were just in the middle of them. And this was in a way a leading idea throughout the whole performance. The 4 saxophone players never play the saxophones. They are using the saxophones, but I'm using talk boxes. Are you familiar with talk boxes? Talk boxes are effect pedals developed for guitars in the 60s. So it's a sort of vintage technology. And it's basically a small amplifier, but with a special built-in speaker, but the speaker doesn't have a membrane, but the whole sound is projected into a tube. And this tube, traditionally you would hold this tube in your mouth, and then you would play the guitar, and then you could articulate with your mouth, and it created a sort of a wah-wah effect. This was very popular, like in the 60s, and the psychedelic movement, stuff like that. And I used that, but the tube was inserted into where the mouthpiece would go of the saxophone. So basically the tube was prolonged with the whole saxophone. And through the tube, in varying sections, different sounds, synthetic sounds and noisy sounds were played, and then the saxophonists were playing the keys. And by playing the keys, they would change a sort of filtering of those sounds. So by using their saxophones, they actually filtered the sound which was coming from the outside, you could say. And in addition to that, they only used the mouthpieces to play slap tongues, like percussive sounds, and just sustained loud sounds in high registers.
As I understand, right, that these 3 parts, all 3 parts are, let's say, are organized regarding different spatial concept, right?
And you could also say, see the saxophones as little spaces that are created, and where then the musicians are playing with the resonance. So yes, there was definitely a strong concern for the space. Not except for the saxophones, not so much in an acoustic sense, but definitely in the way as a sort of social experience, also as a kind of public space shared with the public. And the musicians start in the middle of the public, then we are going into a more standard concert experience. But then when at the end the audience use their phones, I like this idea that there are quite literally putting the musicians in their pockets, because what they're seeing on the screens are again the private films from the musicians, which they pre-recorded and which are used in different parts of the piece, and that's in the end also playing on the mobile phones of the audience. And then in the end, they're quite literally putting the musicians in their pockets. So it's again this sort of transition of the private to the public to the back to the private.
Yes. Can you just write this? And then there are some dramaturgy inside, right? Yes. Like between all these three sections, right? And how you design and choose. Why it's so, or it could be like rearrange as well. From you can start with the third, and then you can go to the first section, or there is the internal logic why you would like to start with first and then end with that with mobile phone part.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, I think the form should be linear. Yeah, it would not make sense to play the third section first and the first one in the end. It is like a sort of dramaturgical conception. I mean, as you maybe know, I often work with interchangeable sections and different game principles and stuff like that, and where every time you can have a different outcome. This is partly also the case for the middle section, the sort of concert section where the musicians are playing together. But as a whole, the piece does have a sort of fixed dramaturgy, and it would make sense to swap the order of those main sections.
And can you just tell a bit reasoning of this dramaturgy? Why you started with the first one and ended with the third one?
Let me start maybe with the last section. I think in the last section, it's important that the audience is already familiar with this kind of material. So if they were to start, if the piece would start with the audience just reading those QR codes, and then they would see those private films being played, they wouldn't know how to relate it to anything. And I don't think that it would make a lot of sense. And what happens in the actual first section that this material is introduced, that you see the performers with the tablets, and on the tablets you see the same performers doing banal everyday things, and then there are sounds on top of that. And so I think it's important as a dramaturgy to sort of gradually introduce the material in a way that the audience can understand what they're seeing and how the relationships are between the musicians and the different materials that they're experiencing in the piece.
You said that you used Unity, right? But what other softwares were used?
It's only Unity and Super Collider. So all the electronic sounds are composed in Super Collider. And then I'm actually not using any sort of standard speaker setup. So I'm only using the talk boxes of the that are attached to the saxophones as sound outputs, plus 4 small guitar amplifiers. You have those very small battery-driven guitar amplifiers for practicing, and these are the only other loudspeakers that I'm using. And those 4 little amps are also in the playing positions of the 4 saxophone players. So I wanted to create a piece without any sort of fancy audio system, but only the instruments as resonators, and for which they need the talk boxes, plus this really crappy small amplifier, which each of those amplifiers costs 15 euros. So it's really kind of a deliberate use of low tech when it comes to the speaker system.
And what was sound material, right, or compositional principles of this sound materials which were used in this piece?
Used, first of all, I used the original sound from the recordings of the musicians, the recordings that they provided for me. there were some more materials which I didn't mention. I also asked them, for example, to record themselves practicing. So I also had those little films where they were just practicing the saxophone in conventional ways. So I used those sounds. Then I used a variety of just purely synthesized sounds, which I created in Super Collider. And then there were the sounds that they were playing themselves by just blowing into the mouthpiece or creating slap tongues.
And could you imagine as a piece as sound only, without spatial element or without visual element?
It would not make a lot of sense to me. I mean, you know, this is a question which often comes up with my work. I always hope to, I always try to create music which is interesting also only by listening to the music. However, for me, the whole thing, how the music relates to everything else, what is happening, is just so essential that for my feeling, it wouldn't make sense to only hear the sounds without seeing the relationships to the musicians as performers, and this whole context with the use of space and the role of the audience also in this particular project.
And does this mean, right, that this piece wouldn't be possible to translate in radio? This is not radio piece.
It's not, no.
And can you imagine the same piece, right? Let's say visual as a spatial, but there is no sound.
No, also not. For me, these things just really belong together. And I mean, I've composed, in the past, I've composed a lot of music where you can just play a sound, audio recording and it's the piece. But already for a while, I have been going more and more into this direction where I'm composed audio visually. I have many pieces where it's a lot about something was shown on a video screen and the music. And in the last years, it has expanded even more into practices where I'm using space in particular ways or additional technologies. So for quite some time, I saw myself as an audiovisual composer, and now I think that it's more appropriate to say intermedia composer, because it's not only about video and audio anymore, but also the use of many different other technologies or specific devices, like in this case, the use of the saxophones as filtering objects and so on. And if you don't really see that, it's I mean, the sound might still be interesting, but to see how it's created is just part of the experience.
Could it be only video piece, right? So that video and audio, YouTube piece, right? So, or its spatial element is so important that you cannot perceive the piece without being in, being present.
I think you saw the documentation, and in the documentation, I tried as much as it's possible to make understandable the role of the space, or at least those transitions, how you're moving between different spaces and so on. I mean, a recording is never fully replicates the live experience, but I do think that by watching the video, you understand what's going on. So for me, that's decent documentation of the experience.
Okay, and right, how your cooperation, right, with this performers, with this ensemble, how it shaped the piece?
It's a very nice experience. We worked on the piece quite intensely, and I mean, the basic form of the piece and the different sections, they were all kind of planned out from already before. So I wouldn't say that there were any changes in the basic conception of the piece. However, there were many details that we worked out in the rehearsal, which are really quite important regarding articulation, how they shape the rhythms when, for example, they did the filtering with the saxophone. So there were quite a large number of smaller details that emerged during the rehearsal process that we then also discussed and some of fixed as integral parts of the piece.
And how long it took to write the piece? And what was the stages, like main stages you go through?
I always forget those things once the piece is finished. I'm writing everything in little notebooks. I have notebooks of varying sizes where basically the composition process is documented. I never really look back at them. I very rarely do. In this case, I didn't look back, but I do remember that the composition process was very difficult for me, and I felt stuck many times. And the funny thing in this piece was that I had already developed quite a lot of the piece. I had built the building. I knew what the interactions would be between the saxophonist and the multimedia performer. I had the surveillance cameras. All of that was there and working, and it just didn't make sense. And I was at a certain point, I really felt a little bit desperate because I didn't know how to solve this. And what led to the breakthrough was something which is extremely banal. You might remember, if you watch the movie, that when the multimedia player navigates through the house, there is a sort of avatar, and the avatar is a group of butterflies that he gradually releases. So when he starts walking through the building, he first has to get to certain trigger zones. And in the end, what you always see in front of the camera are 4 butterflies which are flying around. In the very, very beginning, I didn't have butterflies. Instead, I had a wolf. And I thought the wolf for me was a sort of metaphor for this sort of idea of the lonely wolf, the person, the classical musician who always has to stay at home and practice and practice and practice. So in the very beginning, I had all the navigation worked out, but instead of having the butterflies flying around, I had a wolf which was walking through the building. And at this point where I really felt stuck, I just realized that the wolf was a wrong choice. And I decided to replace the wolf with butterflies. And at this point, I couldn't even say why, but somehow I felt that butterflies are a better choice than the wolf. And once I replaced the wolf with the butterfly, for me, the whole piece started making sense. And then I could finish the composition and everything felt like it fell into the right place. Yeah. And yeah, these are things in creative processes that I don't fully understand. But for me, this was really a sort of decisive point where I couldn't go any further and where I really had to just replace this avatar, and suddenly the piece made sense for me.
Yeah, but how you started? You start with some conception and then you build the musical parts, or you build visual parts, or how it...
different layers, layers at the same time. I knew that I wanted to work with this personal material of the musicians. So one of the first things was that I asked the musicians to make those recordings of themselves. And at the same time, I already knew that I wanted to have like a house, which is going to be the house that they kind of metaphorically inhabit. So I started building the house in Blender. And these were like the first two things that I was doing. And then I developed the interaction with the movement in the house, the surveillance cameras, and how this is triggering different sounds in Super Collider. Before that, I had already received the videos from the musicians, so I started to process the sounds that were on those videos and develop a sort of palette of sounds that were based on that. So this is basically how I started with the assignment for the musicians, building the house, building the interactions, connecting the sounds, and yeah.
And then, okay, this was stage one. What's happened in stage two, right?
Well, then there was a lot of details, of course. So there are, now I said that there are these three main sections, but actually in the concert piece, a lot is going on. So it's not only this one state which is happening, but there are a number of different sections. So what I had to work out is what is happening in the other sections. And I integrated in various ways those other videos of the musicians from their private houses. This was also juxtaposed with the the 3D environment that you see. So there are many details that I had to work out, many musical details where I had to then work out what sort of harmonic principle the whole piece would be based on. And this kept me busy for a long time. The whole piece is has a total duration of about 25 minutes. Of those 25 minutes, around at least 15 minutes are the actual performance in the concert hall, excluding the section with the mobile phones of the audience. And so in those 15 minutes, as I said, there were many different sections, also kind of reoccurring sections, but then I had to take care of deciding what sort of variations would happen when sections reoccur. So these are the fine details which just take a lot of time to do.
And how long was the rehearsal process, and how it was organized?
Short, because it was organized as part of the workshop that was happening. So we were actually, in fact, I arrived 2 days earlier. So we did have like 1.5 days of rehearsals. And then we had a few more rehearsals that we had to squeeze in between those other activities that were happening, with giving lessons, practicing, and so on. I mean, the musicians had to practice the whole repertoire that the participants of the courses also brought along. So altogether, we didn't really have a lot of rehearsal time. I think we had 3 rehearsals and a dress rehearsal. That's it.
And what are the three main learnings, right? Which you learned through this piece for yourself?
Very good question. Let me think. I don't know if I can really list 3, but what was definitely, I wouldn't say that this is like a kind of learning lesson, but what I really found very impressive is what I already described to you, with this sort of crisis moment that I had, and which I solved just by replacing a wolf with butterflies, which is just so absurd. But interesting at this point was that this was a point where I just had to 100% trust my intuition. And I just knew that the wolf is wrong, and somehow I felt that butterflies are right, even though it didn't make any sense to use butterflies. But I'm still convinced that butterflies were the right choice. But it's still one of those things where I'm fascinated by those strange turns that such a creative process can take. Yeah, I don't know if this is like where if this is something where I can speak of a sort of lesson learned, but it was definitely a very striking and somewhat, to this degree, a unique experience. What I found a major challenge in the piece was to create a balance between 4 saxophone players and this entire multimedia environment and this whole entanglement of the technology, but then at the same time using very low tech when it comes to sound, and also giving the musicians a very prominent role, even though I denied them of using their instruments in a normal way. So that was something what I found very challenging, and I think I did find a solution that works, for at least for me. And the third big challenge was to create a situation for the audience which provides them with sort of different proximities to the performers and to the media that they're using. And if I speak of proximities, I really mean it in a quite literal way, that there are these moments where they are close to the musicians, simply because the musicians are playing, standing next to them at the very beginning. Then is this sort of standard concert situation, and then in the end where the musicians basically are captured on their mobile phones, and they the audience members walk away and can put them in their pockets. So this was for me, that's also why I had this very planned out dramaturgy in this case, because I really thought it's important to have those different qualities. I would even speak of qualities of encounter between audience and musicians. And this was also something that was very important for me. So as you see, I didn't answer your question. These were not 3, how did you say it? 3 important things I learned, but I think 3 important challenges that I had to confront.
And last question, what would be your suggestion to other composers who just start thinking, right, about or start composing, right, the pieces which contain some game elements, right? What are the most important things what they should take into account?
In a general sense, I would say if they work with game elements, I think that they should really be very aware of the musical potential of the game elements. That's in a way the essence of what my whole research into games was about. From the start, I was somewhat convinced that combining game principles and music not only created an interesting sort of cross-section between 2 very different media, but I was really convinced that games can bring in very, very particular musical qualities that you can't obtain in other ways. And I still think that this is true. And I think that this is really something very exciting and valuable to explore. So if somebody wants to get into that, I would advise them to really look out for this sort of direct interrelationship that game principles can have with musical qualities.
Thank you very much, Marko, for our talk.
Thank you, Sandesh.